Lindberg. I'm a senior fellow here at Hudson Institute, and it's my great pleasure to welcome today Janis Garisons, who's the State Secretary at the Ministry of Defense in Latvia, and Steve Flanagan, a senior political scientist at RAND Corporation. Our topic today is a new approach, a new paradigm for the defense of the Baltics. And both of these gents, the one who's been executing this proposition and the one who's been describing it eloquently in this terrific report, Deterring Russian Aggression in the Baltic States Through Resilience and Resistance, of which we've got a couple copies, but you can certainly find it on the RAND website and download it there, and I would certainly recommend it if you're interested in this particular topic. We have two very capable people to discuss this. I just want to spend a moment introducing the topic. I spent a lot of time going back and forth to the Baltics, going back really to the V10 meeting in Vilnius, at the very beginning of the new millennium, as we were first talking about the possibility of enlarging NATO to include the Baltics, as well as other additional countries, following the first round with Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. One of the things that I think has been striking over the years is the way in which the perception within the Baltic states, and by the way, we all speak in shorthand and refer to the Baltics, but we also should be mindful as people in the Baltics will tell you that they're not triplets. They actually are distinct places with distinct personalities and character, et cetera. But there is obviously a regional affinity and a tremendous amount of effort in working together, cooperative, especially. But the perception in the Baltics, I think you could a little bit say, was always one of greater degree of wariness of the eastern neighbor. And sometimes this actually annoyed Washington, which didn't necessarily share that perception. But I do think that starting in 2008, after the Russian incursion into Georgia, those complaints, or those concerns, shall we say, started to be taken more seriously. And there were some questions that one heard when one was in the region. And I think the most important one of which was, what are NATO's plans for the defense of the Baltics? And interestingly enough, that was a pretty good question, because there wasn't much in the way of forward-looking planning done on that subject. But this situation, I think, took a very different turn after the Russian incursion into Ukraine. And it was at this point, I think, that we began to see a new set of questions being asked in the Baltics, and they're more or less the subject that we'll be addressing today, which is not only what NATO can do, but what can these states do themselves? We are coming up on the 80th anniversary in November of the Winter War, the attack of the Soviet Union on Finland. And that was a very interesting sort of piece of the conflict of the mid-20th century. The Soviets demanded terms of the Finns. The Finns refused. The Soviets invaded. And in the course of several months, finally did manage to break through the Mannerheim Line in Finland and increase the terms that they were demanding. And you could say that this was a defeat of a kind for Finland, but not really ultimately a defeat in two senses. One, Finland retained its independence. This was not Comrade Stalin's goal. And the second thing that happened is that while the Finns suffered horribly in this war, with 26,000 killed in action and perhaps 100,000 casualties or so, the Soviets suffered worse, in the sense that they suffered 150,000 killed in action during this war, and then a concomitant multiple. So although they were able to obtain some very nice lakefront real estate on Ladoga, they paid a very, very high price for it. And it is this, I think, thinking that is animating this new defense paradigm in the Baltics, that there is possibly with sufficient advanced preparation, a way that the Baltics themselves could escalate the cost of any potential aggression, and therefore have a deterrent, an additional local deterrent effect on that possibility. So these are the issues that I would like to explore today. And I think I'll turn first to Janis and just ask if Tell us a little bit about what's going on in this project.
Well, thank you, first of all. Thank you, Hudson Institute, for organizing this. And it's interesting that you started actually referring to, with reference to Winter War, because that was also my intention.
I'm sorry.
I think I probably have to give a little bit historical background why we react now, because there's some historical memories, and one of those historical memories that in 1940, when Finland decided to resist, our leaders decided actually to not resist and not to fight Soviets, and the argument was that it would be too bloody and we would lose too much. But as a consequence of that, then for those who don't know, we lost almost more than 10% of our population, because when Soviets came, then NKVD or KGB killed thousands, then more than around hundred thousands were exported to Siberia, where majority of them were killed or died naturally, and actually then we suffered 50 years of occupation, which was not a pleasant thing, because I myself remember that. And then, but on the other side, we had actually all three Baltics. We had experience of so-called forest brothers for years, which Russians don't like to recognize now, but actually they were at least until 55. So in some places there were people who were resisting in forests, and actual Soviets, with all their might, could not do anything about those people who decided to resist. And of course, Winter War is, I think, a good example of what happens if you choose the right strategy. Because why United States and allies can't win Afghanistan? Because there are no divisions there, and nobody fights conventional war there. But still, we have problems of actually achieving our goals. And that probably is something what we have to look, and we actually looking as an example. And also Winter War, where basically Finland used, I would say, asymmetric warfare against conventional Soviet strategy, and used their geography and natural causes in their advantage, and actually caused enormous damage, where one battalion actually, famous Suomensalmi battle, where a battalion of Finns defeated or destroyed completely Russian motorized division, mechanized division, and therefore it's not always, and as Klaus would say, there's no dialectic development of war. It's you always, it's wrestling, and therefore, and if you look now in current our environment, it's very clear that we're facing different kind of, unfriendly Russian activities on daily basis. That is information and psychological warfare, and basically we see that the battle, the primary goal of this battle is about the brains of our people, and we've seen it very strong, developing since 2000, somewhere 2000, starting with 2005, slowly, and that is a battle. When we some years ago, 10 years ago, already started talking about, everybody thought, oh, these stupid Baltics, Russophobes and things like that. But that was basically when you can develop whatever strong military you like, but if your population actually is brainwashed and doesn't have will and doesn't have willingness to defend or belong even to the countries, then you will be defeated anyway. And therefore, looking how we can address also that environment, and not only preparing for potential military conflict, but also how to survive in that kind of environment when you have neighbor who is very pushy and aggressive and use different tools for that, and who has a lot of money for those purposes. Then we came up to conclusion that we have to develop comprehensive defense, and that was actually, we don't say that it's a total defense as it was in Cold War years, but we have to find something new, and that new is actually we have to deal with preparedness, and actually we have to preparedness of whole society. And preparedness to society of society means also that it will strengthen resilience of people, because if people are what does resilient means? Resilience means that the people and society as such is ready for the worst case scenarios, and they are ready not only to face them but also survive, and that gives you psychological resilience. And you can't achieve psychological resilience if you don't talk about that. Basically, you have to talk. Unfortunately, it's sometimes unpleasant, but you have to talk, and you have to deal with all those issues. And therefore, we also from last year we starting introduce into schools state defense curriculum, basically where we. It's partially based on cadet education program, but there is also the more critical thinking, information warfare, cyber things, but there is also the military block in that education, and the volunteers can voluntarily, those people can also join boot camps in summer. And I think that is, I aware that that might be very contentious in some environment, but but we understood that basically, if you not deal with those issues and you don't prepare, especially younger generation for that kind of scenarios, and younger generation simply play mobile phones, and on the other side there's. And it's not only about Russia, it's also about, generally where we're heading. If there are people who are ready to fight for simple ideas, and they're not paid. And on our side, we have, let's say, a very materialistic society, which if you don't have, if you will not have increase of salaries next day, we will not do anything. And that, I think that is a big strategic problem in the future. And it's not only, for Baltics to answer, but concluding, I think why we actually doing comprehensive defense to strengthen resilience of society and basically to make our whole society, where the military would play, of course, part, but the whole society and resilience, which is also important in peacetime, not only in the wartime.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Let me turn to Steve. Steve, you and your colleagues at RAND have looked at some level of detail at this. And first of all, tell us what exactly we mean by resilience and resistance, sure. And how far along are these countries in pursuit of that?
Sure. Great. Well, thank you, Todd. Thanks for the opportunity to join this panel. It's great to see a number of friends and former colleagues in the audience as well. So we were commissioned at RAND. Actually, this began back in the summer of '16 to take a look. By two offices in the Pentagon asked us to take a deeper look at what each of the three Baltic governments really were doing in efforts to enhance what they were calling at that time unconventional approaches to their defense, which has a very specific term meaning in some military terminology. We weren't talking about unconventional warfare per se. They were interested in looking at what these governments were doing in terms of improving their National Guard forces, in strengthening societal resilience to deal with disaster preparation of either civil or a military kind of a crisis, and looking at other ways to educate, as State Secretary Garisons was just saying, educate the population to begin to build, and also at measures well short of open conflict, strengthening the critical infrastructure, dealing with the daily barrage, as we found in our discussions in the region. The sense that all three governments are facing and countries are facing a daily war of ideas, a war of information that is inflicted upon them by various Russian media trolls, social media, fake news, all sorts of planted kind of stories, trying to just keep all three countries, and a number of the countries, of course, in Central and Eastern Europe, a bit off keel, a bit on edge, and as a way to potentially prepare the ground to provide for an opportunity to take some action that might compromise their sovereignty, or in the concern that worries me most, to kind of cause a crisis in the alliance through taking some kind of an action. But at the lower level of these activities, the question was, what were some of these? And what we found was, actually, it's a very good news story, particularly in the era of, why don't Europeans do more to enhance their defense? That was not what we set out to answer, but what we found was that all three Baltic states have done quite a bit over the last several years, particularly after 2014, and obviously for the good reasons that Todd noted. But they've stepped up their game on not only defense spending, they've all reached in the last year and so the 2% level. Some had been there already, but they've also taken these steps to become, to improve their investments in, as I said, in the development of these National Guard forces, in the societal preparation and education. And with serious kind of efforts at training, and we could go into that in the discussion a bit, but these National Guard units that they have, ZS they're called in Latvia, in Estonia, the Kaitsalit, they have serious training requirements. They have to go back, they're on call, they have serious plans for enhancing. So we were asked to look at, well, what could the United States, what could other NATO allies do to help enhance these capabilities that were underway? And our government the U.S. government was very well aware of some of these capabilities. They've been working closely, particularly since 2014, with all three governments and others in the region, even before the NATO enhanced forward presence was put in place. Special operations forces, in particular, helping to train some of the units there, on the U.S. side, but also regular exercises. So looking at the full spectrum. And so what we looked at was, where each of these governments going, and I don't mean to grade them, but I can just give you the sort of the quick thumbnail sketch. First of all, Estonia has been very committed to this notion for some time in terms of developing their territorial defense forces. They have a very highly decentralized by province sort of approach to regional defense. They've also had done a lot on strengthening resilience and resistance capabilities. And that means, citizen participation, and it can be both nonviolent, just sort of impeding or disrupting any kind of aggression against the country, or it can be violent. We looked at both and what the U.S. and others could do to aid that development. The Latvian government, and certainly I'll let the State Secretary speak to more detail on this, but they had prioritized, particularly after the financial crisis of 2008, had prioritized their maintaining their national armed forces, the standing arm, the professional army. But since 2015, they've made significant investments in enhancing their National Guard forces and in also building this comprehensive defense concept, the sense that all of society is responsible for the defense of Latvia. And so I give their government great credit in moving ahead with this, and serious, all three governments taking serious national level activities from time to time to try to actually test some of these out. And then the Lithuanians also had been a bit more focused on, partly because of their geography, partly because they don't feel that they have this potential insider threat, if you will, of a large Russian-speaking citizenry. And we should talk a little bit about that more too, because I don't think it's the threat that some people think it is. But that they have been focused on using their National Guard and as a reserve force to support their national defense, particularly to help prevent the Baltics from being cut off in the much discussed Suwalki Gap between Kaliningrad and where Lithuania comes and Poland come between Kaliningrad and Belarus. So they've been more focused on that, but they have done quite a bit on that, and they've really been quite a leader in Lithuania. I think in civilian education, they have several handbooks. Some of you may have seen them. They're quite impressive and artfully illustrated of what to do if little green men come, how to deal with a civil disaster, and I commend them. Some of them are actually in English too on the Lithuanian government websites. So these, but and so we talked about these techniques, and some people would say, well, these are kind of last-ditch efforts. These are, the Forest Brothers. After you've already been overrun, these forces could do something. Well, no. What we found and what we argued, and we didn't do sophisticated wargaming on this, although we have at RAND incorporated some of these forces into some of the wargaming we've done. But we did look at sort of scenarios of at different kinds of scenarios, how could these capabilities, these forces, including civilian resistors up to armed, resistors, their National Guard forces, what can they do? And what we concluded was they really are full spectrum capability, as are their special operations forces. They're not just to deal with, yes, they can slow down and impede a limited incursion or a provocation that's designed to test national defenses. But they can also serve as an important effort at resisting once there were, and many of those, all three governments want to get the society ready for the notion that a loss of territory doesn't mean the loss of war. I think they have serious plans for national continuity. And they really want to be sure that if there were some effort to test their mettle and to test NATO's solidarity, that they could show that they could hold off for some time. And of course, given the time-distance problem, which many of you are probably familiar with in terms of a broad conventional defense of the region, any kind of time that could be bought for NATO and U.S. reinforcements, U.S. and other NATO reinforcements to be brought into play, is time that would be well spent and enhance, we think, overall deterrence. Because if the so-called, smash and grab, the quick, various scenarios people have talked about in Estonia. There's been talk over the years of the Narva grab, which is where there's a heavy Russian-speaking population. A quick thing, and then the Russians sue for peace and say, and if you try to reverse this, we might unleash nuclear weapons and all sorts of other things. So just cease and desist your efforts to undo to restore the status quo. Well, we think that all of these capabilities can be helpful. And if there were, God forbid, such a military action, which I don't personally think is likely, but if there were such a broad military action, these forces could also be the core of an active cell of resistance. They could, the bravery and the skill and cunning of the Forest Brothers would be hard to reproduce in the era of modern surveillance technology. And in fact, the forest might be the last place you want to hide because of infrared sensors and other things. But nonetheless, these forces could be very important in providing, for example, serving as forward air controllers to NATO and allied air systems coming in to try to drop in paratroopers or take action against Russian military installations that might have been developed in these countries. So they can play a full role. And then even in the post-conflict, they can play a role in, if you had a societal disruption, even a small part of territory, these kinds of having trained citizens who can help to deal on a local level with restoring order, with policing. We've seen this in countries, in the Middle East where you've had violent disruption, and the whole question of maintaining law and order and restoring peace and disarming potential invaders. So these forces could be and these training skills, the training and skills that these individuals might have could be very helpful. So then, lastly, I'll just say, well, what did we suggest that could be done? What could the U.S. and NATO could do? First of all, that we argued that we ought to expand, the U.S. and NATO ought to expand support for helping these governments with training for crisis management, for civil defense, for countering what's called very broadly the hybrid threat. But these measures short of war, other kinds of things. And indeed, there has been a fair amount of that going on already. I think it's been strengthened with the European Deterrence Initiative that some people in this room helped to develop, that the U.S. has undertaken in supporting other allies to strengthen their capacity to deal with these limited contingencies. To enhance regional intelligence fusion. One of the key things we found was, of course, knowing when being able to detect some of these. If there were, for example, some kind of what some people call as the gray zone threat, that something that looked ambiguous. Maybe we use the motorcycle gang from Moscow that comes across the border and suddenly starts ripping up a town. Well, are they really just a guns from motorcycle guys who got a little bit out of control, or are they perhaps the advanced unit of some Russian special operations forces that wants to try to cause an incident that then will require some kind of intervention. So how do you detect that early on? Well, that means some interaction between police and first responders, dealing with the military, relations between the EU. Some of these things, the border frontier is heavy EU responsibility. NATO understanding this. And there are some fusion cells that the European Union has, that NATO have, that sort of look at all these kinds of information, fusing intelligence with local information as a way to be able to deal with some of these. But we think that some of the connective tissue in those capabilities needs to be, could be strengthened. And indeed, I think there have been some measures to do so. We looked at additional sensors and training. There's some technology fixes. There's some fascinating things that a number of, including some countries in the Baltics themselves, that are looking at of unmanned systems, how you can, multiply your ability to monitor your border and literally remotely controlled little mini tanks and all sorts of interesting technology. But even very, very basic kinds of things, radios, small, small drones, counter-drone capabilities to defeat surveillance that you might be under, that might be using to target some of these forces, sustaining these forces, clothing, shelter, medical goods, caches of material that these forces might need if they were in an area that was under some kind of occupation. So all of these things are elements that the U.S. and others could take to help enhance these capabilities, along with the training and the continued effort to work with these National Guard and Special Operations and other forces that the three countries have been developing, particularly over the last several years. So maybe I should stop there.
Thanks, Steve. That's terrific. I'll remind everybody that the Hudson Institute was founded by Herman Kahn, who left RAND Corporation in order to do some thinking about the unthinkable. So maybe we're in the realm a little bit of the unthinkable, but Kahn's argument was always that if you don't think about it, if you just put your head in the sand, you're actually increasing the risk to yourself, and it's only by trying to think through these kinds of problems that you can, in the case of nuclear weapons, develop a meaningful and serious deterrent strategy. Yeah, it's coming back. Tell me about what you're doing in concert with your neighbors on this subject. Is it a joint? Is there jointness in the Baltics to this? And also, I'd like to know a little bit about how you're. What kind of cooperation and assistance you're getting from the U.S. government?
Well, I think when it comes to Baltics, the defense cooperation amongst three Baltic countries is probably the strongest one, and there's a permanent framework of cooperation, starting from experts to the ministers and chief of defense, and most of things what we're doing, they've been discussed and they've been coordinated among Baltic states. They, of course, I think there's sometimes some limits to what extent we can join forces. And I always very skeptical about people putting too much emphasis on joint procurements, because if you look on our operational environment, joint procurement can deliver only any added value if you basically go for joint maintenance or things like that. But then in our operational environment, we will not take our vehicles to neither Lithuania nor either to Estonia to have maintenance in time of war, and therefore that big saving is somewhere in the disappears. But I think what been positive thing, because what is important to coordinate if something happens during the time of war, or to have, and I always been emphasizing that those command and control is something what is very important, and I think we moved very seriously by establishing multinational division North. It's now in the process of setting up, and I hope by the beginning of next year we will have already initial operational capability reached by this, and then full operational capability. Basically, then we will have full ability to coordinate and command our forces in the region, and. On U.S. assistance, I think we've been satisfied with both what is important U.S. presence in the Baltics. We still have helicopter detachment in Latvia, and there's also training on different levels, and of course the Michigan National Guard, which is our state partnership program. I think we have had the most model relationship, starting with joint deployments in Afghanistan, where we also lost together, unfortunately, soldiers, but also they helped us on daily basis, and we now frequently actually participate in their exercises as well. And there are also financial support from the Congress, which of course we want always more, but what would be very helpful to have probably more longer-term perspective on financial assistance, where we would be able to put down on those gaps, big military gaps that we have in the region, and develop both, putting our money as well. Therefore, I think if you compare from 2014, there have been. We have this is something that is uncomparable right now, because before that it was difficult to get the company of U.S. forces to the Baltics, because it was contagious, and U.S. helicopters did not fly 100 kilometers closer to the Russian border, because this was also problematic for ambassadors usually. But now it's different, and with NATO, EFP, and Canadians, this completely different level of integration, which I think we learning many things, because you can learn those things only when you start operating together. And of course, when it comes to military training, we've never had such intensity of military training as it happens right now. We even, we're developing 3 additional training ranges, and it's still not enough to have everything satisfied.
Yeah, and Steve raised a subject that is touchy, which is the ethnic Russian-speaking population in Latvia. I just wanted to give you a chance to address that.
Well, I think I would certainly want to commend you, because you're probably one of you who said that it's not the big problem, and I think that is exactly what is misperception. Those Russians, yes, they are Russian, but they are our Russians. They've been in Latvia for 30 years, and they have even accent right now. And the funny thing, I can tell the story, when our Russian would go to Russia, and they have cheaper tickets for Russians, and he or she would not be recognized as Russian, because they already have accent. They would. That is, but but you can I think and they already know, especially after Donbass, what happens. It's the best advertisement for what does it mean, what Putin can do for Russians abroad. I think But I think I know always there's the talk about our eastern region, Latgale. Even this BBC documentary about nuclear use of nuclear weapons because of Russian incursion in Latgale. But the reality is that our National Guard brigade in Latgale is the strongest one. And when we measured actually the level of patriotism, and they is even stronger as in other parts of Latvia. Therefore, it's I think it's of course we have to deal with all those integrational issues, and the National Guard and Armed Forces are the best tool of integration. But I would not exaggerate level of to which Russia can manipulate with our Russians.
Thanks. Steve, I want to, first I don't want to cut you off. I do want to get to the questions in a minute. But I wanted to ask specifically, what's going on here? I have some other broader lessons for NATO members, and what might those be?
Yeah, no, I was just going to add just to what State Secretary Garisons said that there is other data. There's survey data both in Latvia that we found, and actually there's annual surveys in Estonia that has been looking at this attitude of the Russian-speaking population there and finding exactly what the State Secretary was saying, that first of all, they've seen the Donbass movie. There's no nostalgia for what a new Novorossiya in Latvia or Estonia could be, but there are certainly social grievances, and there are things that the Russians might try to play to cause a crisis or to cause some social harm. So I think that those are legitimate concerns, but I think all three governments, and I've been following the Baltics since the early '90s, they've made a lot of progress in their social integration with their Russian-speaking communities, which are very diverse. I mean, from there are all sorts of countries of origin today, not just from Russia. But there is actually a growing interest in this. Some of you probably had seen in the recent NATO exercise in Norway this fall called Trident Juncture. There was a discussion about, well, this was a stress test of Norway's total defense concept, which is very similar to the Latvian comprehensive defense approach, and the Finns, the Swedes recently also, the Swedes had a very robust total defense concept as well, all through the Cold War. It's hard to remember, but in the mid-50s, the Swedes had the 7th largest air force in the world. The Swedes are doing quite a bit to enhance their territorial defense, their societal resilience. The Finns, of course, we started with the Winter War. The Finns have been in that game for a long time, and indeed were mentoring the Estonians and others in the region when they regained their independence about establishing some of these capabilities. So there is a growing interest, and there are again within NATO this issue of national societal resilience, national preparations for initial defense is seen as a national responsibility, but there have been encouragements made at recent NATO meetings to exchange best practices, and we have as well some of these centers of excellence that NATO has established for, there's one jointly with the EU and Helsinki on counter-hybrid. You have the Strategic Communications Center of Excellence in Riga. There's one in Lithuania too, I forget well. But in any event, they're all trying to work together, and the cyber one in Estonia, a center of excellence, they're all trying to share best practices and see how the governments can work together more effectively and knit together these capabilities. Again, not that they necessarily would be employed all in tandem or in a comprehensive multi-state way at a given point in time, but nonetheless, if there were a broader conflict, I mean, if there were a full-up regional conflict in northeastern Europe, it would be important to have this connective tissue, to have this capacity to work together, and to communicate, and to be able to seek outside help.
Thanks very much. We've got about 20 minutes for questions, and so I would like to open the floor. Yes, thanks. Wait, even though it's a small room, I'm going to ask you to wait for a microphone just so we get we're recording, and this session is on the record.
Okay, that's fine. You may not want to answer on the record after my question, but my name is Asta Banonas, and I'm a volunteer with the Lithuanian American Community Incorporated, with the Public Affairs Committee. 25 years ago, 30 years ago, I was one of their lobbyists here in town. I met Steve in those days. So my question has to do with how initial plans for the NATO MAP membership were derailed by well-meaning people in the Bush administration, I suppose, who, Mr. Lindberg, you made reference to, that people were, concerned to give Putin a chance, and so they didn't want Lithuania, for instance, having too large a military. The original plan that they submitted to NATO was that they'd try to get a 20,000-man army, but a 200,000-man reserve, active reserve, built up over the years. And of course, the Bush administration, their hair went on fire, saying, don't do this, which played into the hands of the politicians in the country that wanted to stay friendly with Moscow. So the game was played, all the plans were rolled back, defense spending hit below 1%. Luckily, people have woken up since 2014, and I see all of these efforts as sort of, they're trying to make do with what they wasted for 15 years, right? And that the numbers are so small. So my question is, are the Lithuanians thinking about dusting off their original plan, slowly increasing their military? I saw your numbers were 19,000 people in the military forces, and having an active reserve that builds every year so that they can, in fact, create a territorial defense? Because the argument 25 years ago was the Russians might want to reinvade, but if you raise the cost, if they know there's going to be an increased cost for invasion, they'll think twice.
Thank you.
Well, I probably can start. I don't know the historical background of who promised whom, but I think that in general, there was this feeling of which was false, that there are no threats and we're facing only asymmetric problems in Afghanistan and Iraq. And that was not only probably U.S. administration, but whole NATO planning, because at one point we had advice from NATO planners, which nothing to do with Bush administration, but we had advice actually that the National Guard as such is unneeded, and we have to actually abolish it. Happily, we didn't follow NATO advice at that time, and we still have National Guard, which is very useful now for territorial defense. But I think what we I think we have to get over those historical grievances, and we can put, we can say on many occasions, we told you so, but we don't do that. But on what all three Baltics are doing in probably in different way, we understand that yes, we need to actually increase our military forces. Lithuania and Estonia had already for years conscription. Lithuania reinstalled conscription. We keep with professional army, but we put enormous emphasis on National Guard. We recruit National Guard and this school education program where we still believe we'll add also number of trained people, and we have renewed all training, reservist training. We have a big exercise. Last year we had only our national exercise, which actually had 10,000 people for 1 week called in, and which I think for even bigger countries is a big number. Therefore, yes, we do, but I think that I would be very cautious to simply put labels. You know that you have to increase, you have to have conscription, and I think you have to look what is the goal. The goal is to have more military trained people. How you achieve it, it's probably left to each of the country, and because. If we would install conscription right now, we would probably have to abolish National Guard because we would not be able to finance it. And then you have volunteers who want to do and serve, and then you would and then you push conscription. And we decided that we will not do. Returning to conscription as such will not do anything, but on Lithuania.
Yeah. Asta, were you referring to the George W. Bush administration on delay of the map?
Yes.
Yeah. Right. No, because I mean, I don't know. I don't recall that as a notion that the map was delayed. The sequence was in the mid '90s. The United States was very active in going around and having all three countries have a review of their national defense strategy and their development of their armed forces, and that was led by a wonderful Major General by the name of Buzz Kievenauer, General Kievenauer, and they all had their Kievenauer plans, which was not it wasn't meant to be a blueprint, but just some suggestions that were advanced, and that was all supported by the U.S. government at the time. So that was spanning the end of probably Bush 40 and into Clinton, all through Clinton. Then, of course, the Clinton administration in '99 signed the Charter of Partnership with the Baltics, saying they welcome and expect the Baltics would come into NATO at some point, and then, of course, that was realized in 2004. So I don't think that there was any delay. Secretary Garisons, pointed out the fact that, of course, many countries in Europe were first of all, the U.S. was encouraging asking repeatedly, what have you done for us lately in the war on terrorism? So get your forces ready to go. And it wasn't just the Balts, it was the Danes, others that did away with important parts of their conventional defense capabilities in order to support expeditionary counterinsurgency and counterterrorism operations. So that was a big shift. And NATO was beginning to make the turn, even as I had the good fortune to be involved with Secretary Albright and the group of experts in 2009-10 who were helping to develop the current NATO strategic concept. And that was in 2009-10 when everybody thought, well, the risk of war in Europe is still very low. But there was a marker laid down, and that was, of course, because of Georgia, that we could not rule out what many people thought was, never would not happen, at least for some time, the use of force in Europe, in European territory itself. And so that was, there was a marker laid down there. So I think there was a gradual beginning of turning the ship, but like any big organization, it takes time for NATO and for individual allies, and of course defense plans that take 10 or 15 years to be fully realized. So that was the situation. But yeah, no, I believe, and then to the direct question you had on Lithuanians, I do believe, as I understand their current national planning, is they do see using their National Guard force as a reserve, as an operational reserve, not just as both a territorial defense, but as an operational reserve and as in a capacity to support their frontline forces to keep lines of communication open and to defend the various regions of the country. That I think is probably enough said on that.
Mm-hmm. Yes, please.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me? I'm afraid of microphones. Never know how to use them. But
you're doing well so far.
Thank you very much for the lecture. My name is Alexis Zimnitsa. I work with Dr. Leon Aaron at the American Enterprise Institute. And I would like, if I may, to go back and ask a very precise question in regards to the ethnically Russian and Russian-speaking populations in the Baltic states as a potential threat from Russia. I keep thinking of the Ukrainian example back in 2014. As I recall, that was precisely the justification that the Kremlin used in order to justify the incursion. And I wonder how, in your view, the situation in the Baltic states differs from that in Ukraine, and therefore why this scenario might not be played again. Thank you.
Well, thanks. Could you expand a little bit on that?
Well, I think it's a completely different situation if you compare situation by 2014 in Ukraine, where actually there was no, I would say, governmental policy of integration, both social and as a political integration of the nation. We put, since the beginning of regaining of independence, enormous efforts in integrating all society. And we see those results that also, if you would poll now our citizens or whole society, on 99% of population speaks Latvian compared to 55 to 60 in 90 when we regained independence. And therefore we regarded the language as the most important tool of integration. This is one thing. Another important difference is that Ukraine in 2014 unfortunately was lacking any executive authority. Basically, there were no police who would take care because and Russians used this kind of because there was a vacuum of power, and they used this kind of situation actually to advance. And I think also what we learned from situations both in Crimea and in Donbass, that we will not certainly wait until everything will develop and then it will be too late. If you need to react, you need to react at the beginning, not after 2 weeks or whatever it takes. And I understood that is also the problem, because I believe that all ambassadors and all presidents will call and will say, keep calm and don't do anything, don't escalate. And that is how Russians misuse our perception of strategy. Their strategy is escalate as much as possible at the beginning, and then they grab and then they start the escalation. And our strategy always is Western strategy is we consider that is all linear and that will be developed, with diplomatic negotiations, and therefore we always, if we pursue such kind of different strategy, we always will lose. But we're certainly not in a situation like Ukraine in 2014. We are capable of taking care of our country and our citizens. That's I can fully responsible for that.
Steve?
No, I agree with that.
Okay.
I think that's...
Please.
Yeah, Howard Marks. I was in Latvia in 18 months ago in Riga, and also was in Lithuania. And my question, wonderful presentation, a couple of things that were missing, and I don't know if you could talk about them. The first is intelligence. Obviously, the three Baltic states are very small. Russia is huge. So I'm thinking about the Israel example, small versus large, how important intelligence is to them, what the enemy or prospective enemy is thinking or doing or planning. And secondly, air capability. So, if the Baltic states are threatened, should they have an offensive capability? So the Russians feel some stress on their own borders, within maybe 500 kilometers of those borders, to keep them off balance, that there might be a preemptive strike. Thank you.
Well, on intelligence, that is not a subject that normally discussed very publicly, but what I can say is that we have sufficient intelligence, and including U.S. agencies are fed by our intelligence. Therefore, and that is one of, one of our priority, of course, is early warning and situation awareness, because we quite well understand that once what we don't want to be in a situation where we are surprised, because and therefore what we are doing, we're trying to have as much as possible information from sensors what we're developing, and also from our analysis what is going on in Russia, and of course when it's something indicates problems, then we have to start be prepared with actually if, because we believe that there is something Russia can have only strategic advantage if Russia surprises us. That is, and we don't want to be in that kind of situation.
Steve, the second part of that question was sort of a classic of the security dilemma of anarchy, which is what is the point at which what is the point at which your self-defense looks like an aggressive move against a neighbor?
Yes, right. Well, I think none of the things that the Baltics are doing, nor even what NATO has done in terms of this enhanced forward presence. So these three battalions in the Baltics, one in Poland, are hardly an invasion force, and the Russians certainly know that. I think that's, or even the precursor for an invasion force. They'd need a lot more support. There are definitely some things that the three Baltic countries and Poland, that region, could do. Some of my colleagues have looked at this in some of the wargaming they've done. They could certainly use some enhanced short-range air defense systems. Control of the airspace would, in fact, be very critical to the defense of the Baltic and all of northeastern Europe, really. There's there's certainly NATO has a significant air capability, offensive air. Right now, the only regular operations in the Baltics are, of course, the so-called air police, which is that. It's not designed to be countering an offensive. It's meant to secure and maintain the. It's been going on for, what is it, 25 years now, or 20?
Since 2004.
Yeah. Oh, so 20. Yeah. So yeah, almost 25 years. So anyway, 15 years. Anyway, yeah. So that that is a rotating thing where NATO air forces contribute to small groups. They operate from Lithuania, fields in Lithuania and in Estonia now. I believe. I don't think they're operating regularly in Latvia, but they operate over Latvian airspace, certainly to keep surveillance and defense. So they're part of the early warning system, but they're not there primarily to prepare for offensive action if need be, or countering an air attack. But NATO certainly has robust capabilities deployed in U.S. Air Force forces in Germany and England and elsewhere in the region, and of course other NATO air forces that are pretty sizable. Various countries that are buying F-35s and in sizable numbers. So there's lots of NATO air capability. And I think it's important too, there's been a lot of talk about the notion that, well, Russia has this tremendous it's called in military, parlance, the A2 area denial, air defense capability. But I've heard a lot of senior military commanders in the NATO side say we ought not to talk about this as denial. It's contested. There's no doubt about it that if there were a major war in Europe, it would be very, very dangerous, and it would be a dangerous operating environment. But it's not Iron Dome. It's not as if the Russians don't have some vulnerabilities, and they know it. And so the idea that the differences in capabilities that could be part of a deterrent, and again, not on the idea that the U.S. and NATO certainly has made clear they don't want to use these, but if push comes to shove, if there is aggression, we have fairly robust capability to defend the territory and the airspace of all the member states.
Thanks. Let me just, yeah.
Oh, actually, I did want to ask
It has to be very short because we are running out of time. Yeah.
the White House stripped money out of the European Deterrence Initiative. Have you looked at any of the numbers, and have the Senate committee, have the appropriate committees put money back?
I'm not aware of that.
I think we've hit the level of granularity that we're not.
Well,
you got
no, I've
the
seen
answer?
the
Yeah.
list. No, I mean, actually, I have seen the list, and I was in another discussion on Monday about some of. I mean, some of the projects are quite sizable. They were initiatives under the so-called European Deterrence Initiative. It's all military construction funds. I think 750 million. I think is the total. A lot of projects, but some pretty sizable, including ammunition storage facilities in Poland that would be part of supporting the U.S. forces there. DoD schools, the rebuilding of the DoD school in Spangdahlem, which is one of the largest U.S. air bases in Germany. Again, as I understand, the administration is claiming these are not permanent withdrawal of the funding, but that deferral. They were listed. The sheet I saw said deferrals, but these things can be difficult, and there are some people in the room that probably could speak to this better than I. But anyway, I won't put them on the spot. But this is probably not. I'm sure it was not welcome in a number of the countries in the region.
I will never again refer to the possibility of having exhausted the level of granularity at which Steve Flanagan can speak to a subject.
That's right.
Yeah. The other thing, one more
but
thing to mention, I think, about the Winter War is that Finland was alone. And there were some conversations about with the French, with the UK, with others, but it was really there was much of that diplomacy was cynical in the sense that there was no real intention actually ever to deliver any kind of assistance. The Baltics are not alone, and what we're talking about is something that I think is an enhancement of the Article 5 commitment on the part of NATO. And that's the context in which we should also think about this. And so with that, let me thank State Secretary Garisons, Dr. Flanagan. Always a pleasure to see you. And let me thank you. And please join in a hand for the crowd.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thanks. That's great.
Thank you.
Thanks.